So a quick rundown of our agenda for today. We will start with a welcome and a land acknowledgement. Then we'll go over our purpose, role, and guiding principles of the Natural Medicine Work Group. We'll give you a quick refresher on our local regulatory authority as the City of Denver and cover our topics roadmap. And then we'll dive into our guided discussion. And finally, we'll save about 10 minutes at the end of the meeting for public comments. And we'll also discuss next steps and what's next for the work group, as this is our 5th and final meeting. And I'll just also introduce myself, which I neglected to do. So my name is Abby Soyson. I'm a senior policy analyst with Denver's Department of Excise and Licenses. So we'll begin today's meeting with a land acknowledgement. The Department of Excise and Licenses would like to honor and acknowledge that the land on which we live and work is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, as well as being historically tied to at least 48 contemporary tribal nations. We honor those who have stewarded this land throughout generations and recognize that government, academic, and cultural institutions were built on and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. As individuals and as a department, we are committed to working to dismantling ongoing systems and legacies of oppression and inequity, and we value the historical, current, and future contributions of Indigenous communities in Denver. We went over this slide in our last meeting, but just wanted to flag it again for you all that we have some examples here of how the city is putting this land acknowledgement into action through various programs. And this will be available on our website with so that you can click on the links and explore all of this more if you're interested. So now I will hand it over to Erica to go over the purpose and the role of this group.
Thanks, Abby. For those watching, I'm Erica Rogers. I'm the Policy Director in Excise and Licenses. And as we have with all of our meetings, we'll start with an overview of the purpose and role of the work group before we get into the discussion. The purpose of the Natural Medicine Work Group is to provide suggestions and feedback on whether and how the City and County of Denver should license and or regulate natural medicine businesses, with the use of the word businesses encompassing and acknowledging the connotations associated with that word. What does this really mean? It means that we know Colorado voters asked for broader access to natural medicine and that the state will begin issuing licenses next year. We know that there are critical narratives around this series of events and that there's a history of government action that has caused serious harm in communities that have traditionally practiced natural medicine. We know that it is impossible to separate our discussions here today from this history and harm, so we never ask you to do that. We just hope that this group can be a space for aspirational narratives about how the city can support our communities in this new legal landscape as we move forward and face the regulatory questions in front of us. That said, the Natural Medicine Work Group will not re-legislate state law. We do not have the authority to change state law. The work group is advisory in nature. It does not vote on issues or reach consensus on recommendations. When we say that we don't vote or won't be looking to achieve consensus, it's because we want to honor the critical narratives mentioned that are baked into this work. If there is consensus on a particular topic or approach, we will obviously note that in our recommendations, but we do want to ensure that our work group members don't feel pressure to concede on an issue that is important to them. That takes me to my third point, which is that each member is an equal participant and has an equal opportunity to voice opinions and contribute ideas. The city will consider all input gathered throughout this group and from comments from the public in developing recommendations for the mayor and for city council if necessary. Any proposal to license or regulate natural medicine businesses must be approved by city council and the mayor before becoming active, which will incorporate, of course, additional public processes. So now that we've reviewed the purpose and role, I'm also going to repeat these guiding principles that we abide by in our work groups. These are built not just as what we expect from our volunteers who show up as work group members, but also the standards that we try to hold ourselves to as well as the agency facilitating the work group. So it isn't just how we're asking all of you to treat each other, but how we agree to show up for you as well. If you are planning to make a public comment at the end of the meeting, please also keep these guiding principles in mind as you share your feedback. Work group members value the expertise and unique perspectives of all other work group members. Second, work group members recognize the legitimacy of the interests, concerns, and goals of others, whether or not they agree. And finally, work group members treat each other and all meeting attendees with respect, civility, and courtesy. Last, we'll go over our local regulatory authority, which is that local governments may enact ordinances and regulations governing time, place, and manner of the operation of natural medicine licenses or businesses, but they may not prohibit the establishment or operation of natural medicine businesses. They may not prohibit the transportation of natural medicine on public roads by licensed persons, and local governments may not adopt ordinances or regulations that are unreasonable or in conflict with state law. So before we launch into the discussion, we just want to check in on our roadmap. While Abby mentioned this is our last meeting for now, have more information about next steps at the end of the meeting, so it's fresh in your mind. We acknowledge this has been a pretty fast moving timeline, and we know that governments rarely get anything right on the first try, if ever. So we do remain committed to continuous outreach and public input as we move through the next phases of this process, as well as continuous improvement. So if changes are needed in the future, even after the end of this work group, we will still be here to listen and to improve and to hear from any of you who want to remain involved. We know that we cannot do this work in any way other than as a community, so we are super grateful to the incredible depth of expertise and knowledge and passion that each of you bring to this discussion.
Okay, so we will launch into our discussion. As a reminder, the following discussion questions are really meant to help us evaluate whether there is a need for a local license, any local regulations, or other types of programming in addition to what the state is developing in their process. We are not presupposing the need for a local license. We're not presupposing the need for any regulations, but this is what these questions are meant to help us figure out. So with that in mind, we're going to start by addressing some questions that we didn't get to in our last meeting about marketing and advertising. So the State Natural Medicine Division is conducting their own rulemaking process right now. And in their draft rules, specifically draft rule 3505, they have some restrictions on marketing. And those restrictions prohibit deceptive, false, or misleading marketing or statements. They prohibit any claims that natural medicine is safe because it was tested. Marketing that appeals to individuals under 21 is prohibited, and that includes but is not limited to images of minors, cartoons, toys, or similar images and items typically marketed towards minors or reference to products that are commonly associated with minors or marketed to minors. Marketing that appeals to anyone who is not legally allowed to obtain natural medicine services is prohibited. And marketing the transfer of natural medicine for remuneration is prohibited. So marketing sales of natural medicine. So with that context in mind, we wanted to ask you all if you feel like Denver should further limit the marketing and advertising of natural medicine and natural medicine services. And if so, what additional restrictions might be appropriate? So as an example, in Denver, it is unlawful to advertise marijuana anywhere in the city where the advertisement is visible to members of the public from any street, sidewalk, park, or public place. Specifically prohibited marijuana advertising includes advertising using billboards or other outdoor general advertising devices. So things like bus station shelters would be an outdoor general advertising device. Prohibited advertising also includes vehicle-mounted, handheld, or portable signs, or handbills, leaflets, or flyers distributed in a public place, left on a motor vehicle, or posted on public or private property. There are some exemptions to this rule. So prohibited marijuana advertising does not include a fixed sign that exists purely to identify the location of the business. any advertisement in a newspaper or periodical of general circulation, any advertising that's purely incidental to the sponsorship of a charitable event, and apparel, consumer goods, or paraphernalia that only has the business's name and logo on it. So those are all things that are not prohibited advertising in the city of Denver. So the city's advertising rules for marijuana are stricter than those at the state level. And so we wanted to pose the question to you all as to whether you think that we should go further in limiting marketing and advertising of natural medicine here in Denver. So with that, I will open the floor for discussion.
Not everybody at once. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, Noah, please.
I don't think that there need to be any additional restrictions for marketing or advertising. That could also be used to provide education. So I don't think it's a good idea to hinder that. Thanks.
Thanks, Noah. Carissa?
I'm actually experiencing some freezing of the Zoom on my end. So maybe can I share my remarks after Chris?
Sure. Yeah, that's fine. Councilman Hines, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I like that you're comparing this working group with the cannabis working group, or marijuana as it is called in ordinance, but I'm going to keep calling it cannabis. Anyway, will you talk a little bit about the stakeholder process that went into the rules and the restrictions for cannabis, just so we can get a sense of? I kind of like the idea that the rules and restrictions would be similar, but I'm curious a little bit about the stakeholder process that set the current policies.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Erica, you have a longer institutional memory than I do, so please feel free to chime in with additional context. But we had a very similar process. So for a little bit of history on the marijuana ordinance, in 2021, City Council passed an omnibus bill that really reshaped all of Denver's marijuana code. And that was the result of a very similar process to this one. So we had what was called a marijuana licensing work group, very similar process where we brought in a diverse group of stakeholders with expertise in various areas, and asked a lot of similar discussion questions about here's what the state does and what should we do here in Denver based on our community's specific needs. And that group included representatives from Denver Health, I believe, the Public Health and Environment, One Chance to Grow Up was represented on the group, just in terms of the public health and youth advocacy piece of that. And then, of course, we had industry representatives and social justice representatives and other folks who all contributed to that discussion. And I believe those advertising restrictions came in part from what had already been existing in the ordinance prior to 2021, but also were refined a little bit through that group. So some of those exemptions that I mentioned, like the exemption for apparel, consumer goods, and paraphernalia, that was something that came out of that work group that, people didn't feel like T-shirts with a marijuana business's name on it constituted advertising. And so we made that specific carve out. Any other context you want to add, Erica, or maybe Reggie is on the call as well? I think Erica might have dropped off. Okay, hearing none.
Well, if I may, just a little bit more, another part of the consideration back a while ago was to make sure that we were taking a conservative approach to cannabis policy and cannabis implementation. That was also part of the conversation with the Denver psilocybin working group that I happen to participate in, and so in case there's a new stakeholder group, and in case not everyone is familiar with that, I want to recognize and appreciate that we are trying to be we're moving forward in a way that a lot of places don't have this level of adoption, but I do want to thank and recognize that we are doing it in a conservative way. We're doing it in a way that hopefully we can be in the leading edge, but not piss everyone off in the process. So those who were not supportive of natural medicine or psilocybin in 2019, this was a way for them to feel less angry because we weren't shoving it in their face and billboards and whatnot. So just wanted to share that little extra context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councilman Hines. Carissa, did you resolve your issues? Do you want to go next?
Sure. I hope they're resolved. I just want to be clear too on this, that we are not discussing possible retail sales or general consumer sales of products made with natural medicine, and that we are only discussing marketing as it pertains to natural medicine for healing centers and licensed facilitators. Is this correct?
So yes, so state rules prohibit marketing any sort of sales of natural medicine.
Okay.
If there are additional restrictions or additional clarity that we want to put into our ordinance or into guidance from the city, we can also do that as well.
Okay. I think that the guidelines from Draft Rule 3505 are a good start, for sure. I think that could be, I think it's a good baseline. I would also add conversation around, maybe companies should not market or advertise as quote unquote providing indigenous medicine, or advertise themselves as a Colorado native company, or things like claiming to include titles of chief or medicine man or woman person, shaman, curandero, curandera, if they are not in fact owned, operated by indigenous people and those types of medicine people, and if they're not continuously rooted in indigenous practices. This also includes tokenization, which has impact in communities and life and business, where you can't just hire one indigenous person to for example, take out the trash, then tell people and advertise as an indigenous operated company. I'm also aware that in this space, there might be people who don't quite understand or haven't yet received education on how cultural appropriation leads to violence on indigenous peoples. So I would suggest that government require such education as a condition to obtaining licenses, regardless of the recipient's race. Those are my comments.
So that's really helpful. Gabriella, I saw your hand up, but we can go to Jordan if you don't have a comment at this time. Jordan, hi, welcome.
Hello, thanks, Abby. I understand why some of these things were put into place for cannabis a long time ago, and I think there's some reasonable policies. So I'm not necessarily advocating to not impose them on the natural medicine program, but I do think it's important to highlight that some of the situations are different, where you have medical service providers versus retailers of a product, and that may necessitate at least a different analysis of what policy does or doesn't make sense, regardless of the specifics listed of what's prohibited here. Additionally, I'd be curious if the city has any data or collected any data at any point that indicates that the fact that Denver has gone above and beyond in restricting cannabis business advertising, and whether that's had any material impact, both positive or negative, on public health outcomes or other economic factors or business opportunity factors, because there are many local governments that haven't chosen to impose additional restrictions. And maybe this is just dorky and academic, but I'd be curious if any of the additional restrictions in Denver have had any impact whatsoever, if anyone's looked at it, and maybe that's something to nerd out about down the line. I don't know if it's super relevant here, because I think the primary factor is we're talking about different business types, and therefore policy decision should be based upon the implication of those business types, as opposed to necessarily a retail marijuana store, which is a very different business than the ones that we're discussing here.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. And I can speak a little bit about that, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself for the group, since this is your first meeting, and just let everyone know who you represent.
Oh, I'm Jordan Wellington. I am a partner at a firm called Strategy 64, and we do public policy work in the cannabis and psychedelic space.
Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, Jordan is filling in for Bia Campbell today. So to your question about advertising, and research on the impact it's had on youth use in Denver, what we rely on for monitoring youth use in Denver is called the Healthy Kids Colorado Survey. And this year, so for the 2023 results and then the 2019 results, it's a survey that's administered every 2 years. We've seen that youth use is holding at about 11% in Denver. So that's 11% of high school students reporting using marijuana in the past 30 days. And that's the primary measure that we look at when we're looking at youth marijuana use. And that is down significantly from the mid 20% range prior to 2019. And Denver in 2023 and 2021 was below the state average for that measure. Do we know if that's directly tied to advertising restrictions? No, we don't have anything that directly links those things, but the advertising restrictions are part of a multi-pronged approach that we take in Denver in combination with things like location restrictions, funding after school programs, and other type in our education program, the high cost campaign. All of those things go into preventing an increase in youth marijuana use. I will also note that our marijuana advertising rules are geared towards preventing an increase in youth marijuana use, and that's obviously important in natural medicine as well. But I want to note that something we talked about in our last meeting is the legislative intent of Senate Bill 290 to prevent the over-commodification and commercialization of natural medicine in a way that exploits Indigenous and Native American communities. And I think that's a really important piece of this advertising conversation as well. So certainly don't want that to get lost. And Carissa, you did a wonderful job of highlighting that as well. And it looks like Gabriella and Councilwoman Lewis echoed your comments in the chat as well. So appreciate that. Yeah, Dale.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, I just want to echo. I do worry about the advertisement of psilocybin and these healing centers. I think this is the space, the advertising, the marketing, that's where it's going to be really ripe for cultural appropriation, as well as kind of medical misinformation too. And so, particularly with somewhat a lack of a large literature database of knowledge about some of the effects and how it's going to be implemented, I definitely think there should be some additional restrictions on marketing and advertising similar to cannabis, even though I know it's a different substance. It's also a different model with a lack of retail. Yeah, I think I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a great point about the medical misinformation. That's helpful. Any other thoughts before we move on? Yeah, Gabriella.
Yeah, I don't remember if it was this one or the state working group with the federally recognized American tribes and indigenous group. There was a conversation as well about advertising, and one of the questions was, how would it be enforceable? Right, so we've expressed concerns, Carissa and myself, about the misrepresentation and the tokenization and all of those concerns, and how they would be enforced. And then who gets to decide, like, you know, who this isn't appropriate, this is not. I definitely have said that I don't want the government to have any part of that, and part of saying this is acceptable, this is not, okay, you're appropriating an indigenous tradition, okay, any kind of definition or deciding who is allowed to claim indigenous representation. There's a real pattern of harm and discrimination and racism on the government and cities. So that would be something I would recommend, that an indigenous consulting group or indigenous company, or I do not want this to be in the hands of the government or industry either.
Thank you, Gabriella. That's helpful feedback. Anybody else before we move on? Marcy, please.
I was going to say I agree very much with what Carissa said, and making sure that people aren't using the terms medicine woman, medicine man, curandero, shaman, all of those things without checking with that person specifically and making sure that they have the authenticity to use those terms. And also with regards to advertising, I think it's important to note that there are a lot of types of facilities and treatment centers and medical centers or mental centers that advertise as well. So in this sense, I think it's important to use those terms as how we.
Thanks, Marcy. It looks like Shane has a question in the chat. He asks, do these restrictions also restrict public advertising of programs or services that are not offering actual medicines, but are rather offering services like psychedelic education, integration, or harm reduction services? These seem like blanket restrictions without enough nuance and consideration for evidence-based, established, and beneficial mental health related practices. These restrictions are tying our hands behind our backs and expecting us to still have the ability to help to the greatest extent possible. So I'll try and answer as best I can, but Shane, please feel free to chime in and clarify if I'm not understanding correctly. But these restrictions that are on the slide are restrictions that currently exist for marijuana businesses. And then the restrictions that I covered on the previous slide, these ones are in draft rules for the state. So the State Department of Revenue is doing their rulemaking, and these are what have been proposed as far as marketing and advertising restrictions for natural medicine businesses. So two separate sets of requirements. These marijuana restrictions are not in place for natural medicine at the local level. They're just an example of another industry where we go further than the state in regulating advertising. But happy to clarify further, or if you want to jump on and add anything, please do feel free.
And I think too, right, the distinction that we've talked about here matters in that, you know, in our definition of advertising for cannabis, for marijuana, it is directly tied to the ability to have retail purchases, right? It is defined in a way that relates back to that retail, basically commodity. So I think there's a distinction in that sense too. So Shane, if there's anything you want us to keep in mind, knowing all of that, please feel free to let us know.
Okay, Councilman Hines.
Yeah, thank you. And I also want to thank Shane for the comments. You know, if Big Pharma can advertise a whole slew of drugs and countless public venues, why is natural medicine being restricted? And it's a comment about how it's hypocritical. I agree. And Big Pharma is predatory. They take advantage of people who may or may not know. You know, they're not all of us are medical professionals. The difference in my thought process is that there's widespread general acceptance with the pharmaceutical industry. They're predatory, but people are aware of them. Whereas we're we're breaking barriers. We're pushing the envelope with cannabis, as we did as far back as 2011, and we're changing the way the nation thinks about cannabis. And then now we're we're on the leading edge of psilocybin too, and natural medicine. And so I see that that's the difference, is that big pharma has widespread understanding and acceptance, and what we're looking at today doesn't necessarily yet. And so I believe it's our charge to introduce people to natural medicine in a way that doesn't backfire, and then have people say, "I told you so," and then we start regressing in our policy for natural medicine and maybe cannabis too. So that's my thought process, and it's a good point though that big pharma is. I mean, they're thinking about shareholders, not the people who are actually accepting the Western drugs. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, thanks everyone. That was a really great discussion. We do want to move on so we can make sure to get to all of our topics today. So I'm going to hand it over to Erica to take us through a discussion about community input options.
Thanks, Abby. I'm super excited to get to this portion of the discussion. As you can tell by our public work group, we love talking to the public. We love community input. We want to hear, we've heard over the last 4 meetings, all kinds of different ideas for, oversight, for input, for what should be left to the community. So the idea here is to have a conversation around some other examples that we use in the city, and then hear kind of, in addition to what everyone's already shared, any other ideas that we can incorporate, whether there's a license or not. So I'll walk us through a few examples, and then we can have a discussion on this piece. So we'll start with evidence of community support for certain types of liquor licenses. This is kind of the biggest area our department gets feedback in. So as part of this, especially our liquor common consumption area license, we require, as part of an application for that license, that the applicant submit evidence of community support to show that they've already went and talked to the community and found people who are in support. So in that particular licensing program, that can count as a letter or other document that says either support or non-opposition. We would also accept a good neighbor agreement, or if there were any other form of evidence, that indicated that the community was on board with this particular application, we would include that as well. The eligible neighborhood organizations that can kind of weigh in on this sort of process are RNOs that have boundaries, including a portion of the property where that license is located. They've had to be in existence for more than 2 years to kind of prevent people just popping up, ad hoc to support things and then disappearing, right? We want them to be actual community fixtures. And then, if there isn't such an organization, right? Some communities don't organize in the way that an RNO, registered neighborhood organization, operates. So if there's a designation of, residents or property owners or other stakeholders that is an eligible group, they could also meet that definition. So that's one example. We'll go to the
Erica, could you briefly describe what a good neighbor agreement is?
Oh, yes, sorry. A good neighbor agreement is a private contract between a business owner usually, and most often a registered neighborhood organization, but it could also be an HOA, a business organization, any kind of group, right? But it's a private agreement between the parties, basically, where the business agrees to certain not necessarily restrictions, but an agreement on how they're going to operate in harmony with the community, right? So for our liquor licensed or marijuana licensed businesses, one of our most popular ones is, the time that they take out the trash. If you're a liquor establishment that has a lot of bottles and you're around neighbors, they don't want you dumping all those loud bottles out into the trash can at 3 a.m., waking up sleeping babies, things like that. So they'll agree to put trash out at a certain time per the neighbor agreement. So that's just one example. All right, the next set of options, again, are in our department. So this applies for several types of licenses, including marijuana licenses and liquor licenses, and then social room licenses, which are neither. They're sort of rare, but these are essentially kind of on-premise gathering places where, you know, communities may experience issues with noise or congregation, parking, trash, things like that. But these types of licenses, either in state law or local ordinance, require a public hearing to get at what's called needs and desires. At these hearings, residents and business owners within a certain buffer zone around the business or proposed business called a designated area, they're permitted to testify, and they can either support or oppose the license based on whether there's a sufficient amount of locations that meet the need, or whether they actually desire the license to issue. So the the business has the burden of proof to show that there's a need and desire in the neighborhood. But anyone in the designated area can submit petitions, those good neighbor agreements that I mentioned, or affidavits to show that there either is or isn't desire for that license. As an aside, if you're curious about that, we've got a link for more information, but that's a pretty often used process within our department. And then I wanted to touch on some of the things that another agency does. This is in community planning and development. I'm not with CPD, so if I mix anything up, apologies. But this is my understanding of kind of the rezoning process and Board of Adjustment hearings when there are zone or building, kind of reassessments either at a particular parcel or property or zone district. So for rezoning hearings, they require pre-application meetings between kind of the applicant and the community. They strongly encourage the community and city council members to participate. And for that, applicants seeking the rezoning to work with those community members. CPD will send postcards to property owners within 200 feet of that rezoning. They're also soon expanding that, hopefully, to include renters, not just property owners. They also post notice at the property at each step of the process. That's something we also do for our needs and desires hearing. And then they give property owners and soon renters the opportunity to sign what's called a protest petition, which heightens the level of approval needed for that rezoning. Rather than a majority of council, it would need a supermajority of council if they meet a certain threshold of protest. So that's within rezoning. For Board of Adjustment hearings, it's kind of similar. They send notices to RNOs, those registered neighborhood organizations within 200 feet of that property, as well as the city council person for the district. They also post notice at the property, and they do allow anyone to provide public input, which is a little different than the rezoning or our needs and desires, but they do weight the impact of the closest neighbors on the impact for the adjustment. They also have a variety of pieces of evidence that people can submit, like letters, petitions, diagrams, drawing, pretty much anything that can help people show what the impact would be. They can be submitted prior to or at the hearing. So petitions and letters and good neighbor agreements are things that are pretty widely utilized in other processes as well. So with some of that as a background of what the city currently does, some of which has been around for a really long time, some of which we're trying to modernize, and knowing that this is a new and different type of regulatory landscape. Here's the question is, should Denver require input from the community as part of either a licensure process or as a part of our time, place, and manner recommendations for any or all types of natural medicine businesses? So thinking about who should be asked for the input to get to kind of something Gabby has brought up multiple times, right? There's a list of different groups we could look to: registered neighborhood organizations, oversight committees, community leaders or elders, or other types of groups. There's also the question of, what's the best way for input to be collected, whether it's letters, hearings, petitions, other ideas you have. And then as you're kind of, describing what you think is the best route, let us know why, because I think, right, as with any sort of due process, there are certain things cities, governments can and can't do, but if we know the why behind what you're asking for, that will really help us, do our best to meet the goals of what the group is looking for. So with all of that, I'll stop talking, open it up to the floor for additional thoughts and feedback.
Yeah, Noah, go ahead.
Thanks. I do not support any additional requirements for being able to obtain a license. There's, from what I understand, there's already going to be a system in place for filing complaints against any of the licenses. And if any of these license holders are causing a problem in the community, then the community can take action through the complaint department. Thanks.
Thank you, Noah. Nico.
Hello. It seems that many of the licenses that require community input options are businesses that could come with a significant amount of negative externalities, like access to alcohol or rowdy environments or loud noises. Healing centers will likely be low volume, and clients who are in altered states will be indoors under close supervision. And cultivators, as another license type, will not have a retail component and will require sufficient security to reduce any potential of theft risk. And so because of that, I do not think that Denver should require community input for these types of natural medicine licenses. Thank you.
Thanks, Nico. Carissa.
Nico, I appreciate those comments and somewhat agree with that. So thanks for putting that into like perspective. I think that community input should be received for all types of natural medicine. I think it's helpful to host this input path on a public platform, such as like we've done here. We could see much overlap in the discussion, but this is also where we will be able to see which medicines and situations need different considerations. We'll also be able to shine light on the areas where previous guidelines and guidances have been, where we can dial those in better. As far as who should be asked for this input and why, I definitely think that, input from people who, their entire motivation is either to make money and exploit the communities is not helpful. I think input from someone who makes racist comments or who wants to grow mushrooms just because it's cool is not very helpful as well. However, I do think that input from people who have a deep understanding of policy, equity, anti-oppression, DEI, those kind of things, healthcare, culture, and healing, those are very helpful inputs. I think input should include Indigenous tribal leadership, Black and Indigenous community leaders and stakeholders, advocates for Indigenous and environmental justice. And I will also say youth, even, ages kind of like 21 to 26, I think is an important perspective as we move forward. Medicine workers, healers, nurses, medical providers, mental health professionals, veterans, and people and community leaders, especially from disproportionately impacted communities. I think all of these perspectives are very helpful in creating a pathway for us to do better than we did with marijuana. As far as the why goes, due to accessibility issues that many people in Denver must work multiple jobs just to pay rent. We are having a housing and rent crisis. I think creating a diverse set of information paths is necessary. I appreciate and agree with what's already been laid out by Erica as far as like the neighborhood agreements and those methods of including neighborhood input. I think those are good. I would also suggest things like town hall meetings, public video meetings like this, surveys, video and audio entries from community, phone banking, public and free information sessions at different times of day, all spread out all around the metro area. And I'd like to see this for like the why being for accountability of our political leadership and our communities, for community education, and frankly, because more and more of our rights are being stripped on almost a weekly basis. We can do better in Denver, we can do better in Colorado. And finally, because it is government policies, war, government supported and systemic racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, labor exploitation, and poverty that has caused much of the harm that is driving people to seek natural medicine for healing. The very least we can do, I think, as a community and as a society is to include, prioritize, and really take seriously the guidance from the people most impacted in regard to their healing. Thank you.
Thank you, Carissa.
Okay, we'll go next to Tom Allen.
Having some technical difficulties with my camera. It doesn't seem want to display. But I do echo, what some of the people have said on here about, the indigenous part of, what we're doing. Just a thought, is there room for flexibility down the line? Is there something like in the instance, that some of these places want to have, an elder come and do a kind of blessing of the place because, we believe in, having good, spaces and places for this, especially like even the medicine where it's grown or even, where, these healing things are going to be happening, not initially right now. I'm not thinking about, how that would go, but just, having that space of, hey, this is kind of fast. We're doing all this, as we're, we're flying the plane as we're building it. And so I just feel, if we could, have some space for, that indigenous, part, that we're here for, with particularly me, that goes a long way, because we're trying to do groundbreaking things that nobody has done, in this nation, or, we're trying to be firsts. And so that means, we have to be really quick in what we're doing with all these rules, regulations, and things like that. So natives move at a slower pace. Sometimes we contemplate and think about certain things and how it impacts not only us but other tribes, other people, different facets of our whole culture. So I feel like although we're doing these things rather quickly, could we have just a space for like future things should native people feel like well, at least we can go and smudge off this place, or some of the people who may interact with these healing centers, if they have an identity that is Native American but they're not too connected with it, and they seek like, hey, I do want to try and get someone that's Native American to kind of have their perspective and possible interaction with that. I don't think that has ever been kind of talked about. We just brushed upon it like the certification, who's going to verify this, what does that look like, is it tribal ID, is it affiliate? Those things get really kind of complicated, just with AKA United States of America, as opposed to other places that, they have different rules there too. So my input is, if we could just have some kind of, placeholder of, future kind of native inspired things so that, people who are coming late to the table, who are native, they feel like, at least, there's a place that they can, have input and interact, because there are some tribes who they don't have the bandwidth and they're barely learning about this. And, some people feel like, they should have been in on the conversation, even though they're not historically in Colorado, but, they have historical ties to Colorado, particularly, like the Navajo Nation. And so that was just my thoughts on this. Again, just in the United States, there's over 500, federally recognized tribes. And so, having consensus is hard with that many kind of perspectives. So I just feel, if we had that kind of flexibility and, individually with elders within each tribe, posing their input and then, having whoever, represents them moving forward, because I just feel, again, there could be room for that. And then, I do echo all the things that have been said here. It seems like, we're repeating ourselves in some things. We want to be respectful of our people, of our ways, but we do understand too that, this is moving forward, and we want, the end point of healing people with this medicine, and I do believe that's, overall objective, and we can do this respectfully. If we, give some sight, just give some flexibility, and, again, I like, equity, meeting people where they are, and that includes, the many, many groups that are represented here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's really incredible feedback and very helpful and a lot for us to think about. And just wanted to kind of add to that and highlight something that has been said before, I think by Carissa and I'm sure others, but thinking about these community input options, how can we use community input to enhance the self-determination of Indigenous and Native American community members within this natural medicine space? So I want to add a little extra discussion question for you all to think about, but we'll go to Gabriella next.
Yeah, I have a lot to say and I lost my notes, so I'll be writing you as well. But a lot comes up with me with this subject, especially working in community engagement myself and seeing all of the ways that the government really gets it wrong. And we, we've done some work around how the government can better do community engagement, and there's still so many gaps. And one being that community input, for the most part, has been, especially with Black and Indigenous communities and communities of color, has been performative, if it even happens at all. A lot of times the community doesn't know that it's happening or has really short notice, or it's for such a short time frame that there really isn't a real process of meaningful community engagement or reporting processes. So how was that information used and how did you implement it? And so that's one of my major concerns, is that I definitely, for it not to be performative, for it not to be last minute, for it to be funded possibly by the government, but for it to genuinely be led by the communities most impacted, by a Native consulting company. I've expressed many times my uncomfortability around, and that's not my intention here. I can speak to the protection of Indigenous medicine and culture at a general level, but I cannot speak for, and I don't have the permission, and I don't know that anyone here has the permission, the expressed and explicit permission to represent the Mesoamerican traditions of psilocybin and psilocybin medicine, Te Ono Nakat. And so I just always keep referring to that. They also need to be included in community input conversations, not just the local communities here. And it also depends on, is this a manufacturing facility? Is this, and those are the terms that, this legislation has used. That's not what Indigenous communities would call them, but manufacturing centers, cultivating where the extraction is going on. Like, we've talked extensively about how there's already so much environmental violence and racism occurring already in Colorado, particularly around Suncor. And So the want for the government to take out any kind of mention of race so that essentially so that oil and fracking and other pollutants can continue to cause this harm on our communities. And that's also a major concern. And the data collection, I don't know if we've gotten to that, but also a major concern there on the corruption that data collection and science continue to follow, and the corruption and the ways that data can be manipulated and used without consent and used inappropriately and sometimes used to weaponize against Black and Indigenous communities. So all this to say that, you know, we've had 5 meetings and we're not consultants here. We're not being paid professionally. And I'm hesitant because I find myself in a space and see how much of our communities are impacted by the rush of this legislation, again, that wasn't led or informed or consented to by any Indigenous communities. And so we feel this rush, like, well, it's, you know, people tell us it's happening anyways, it's happening anyways. What are the ways that we can cause harm mitigation? And so this rush that I think our communities can feel or have felt is also a form of systemic racism and oppression. And I really want to name that. I feel this process has been really rushed. The Indigenous State Working Group has only recently began to meet, and that is it's going to be a slow process, but also a limited process where it needs to be indefinite. These conversations need to be ongoing. These processes need to be ongoing, and they need to be led by the communities who are most impacted. So some kind of bridging between the impacted communities where these centers and facilities will go and the communities of these medicines. I understand the need that to engage with communities of Native communities of the United States, but most of these medicines don't grow here. And there is, while I understand that these medicines can grow all over the world, the tradition that is being exploited here are the Mesoamerican traditions. Those exclusively have a cultural and historic ties. So we need to involve them in every step of that way. And again, I voiced that this working group cannot be the voice of Indigenous people of these medicines.
Thank you, Gabriella. Carissa?
Thanks. I just had a quick follow-up. I appreciate what Thomas and Gabriella are saying in regard to inclusion of Indigenous peoples. And to follow up with that, as far as the community inputs, I think that we should really be mindful of not placing all of the burden on communities who are already so burdened for survival. And that our governments can take on much of that burden. But what I see in my own analysis is that our government leaders, our government staff, our government programs have not prioritized their own government equity and anti-oppression and inclusion education. So I think there's a gap here between governments and communities. And I think that we could close that a bit and really move forward community input if those, you know, responsible for receiving that input are educated in equity and in the cultural and environmental impacts. Another point I'd like to make that we haven't discussed yet in these meetings is about the impacts on communities who are over-policed, particularly Black and Latino and Indigenous communities in Denver, particularly Black communities who historically have been incarcerated at astronomical rates for marijuana. And although personal use and personal possession of psilocybin mushrooms, psilocybin medicine is legal, that we have seen historically how the law doesn't really matter when it comes to policing Black and brown bodies. And so I think that input from people in these communities is equally as important to what we're talking about, people impacted by the environment, and environmental impacts and cultural appropriation.
Thanks, Carissa. Erica, did you want to address Gabby's question in the chat?
Yeah, and Gabby, feel free to hop into, but she asked in the Q&A, what is the financial cost for these community input sessions? That's a really good question, because I know that that's something our agency is actually looking at right now with liquor and marijuana and that needs and desires hearing, especially within the liquor realm. Most of our applicants for a liquor license do hire an attorney to help represent them at that hearing. It's a quasi-judicial process, and that does have a cost associated. That's a process that has been around for a really long time. And so to try to even, to address some of that burden, that cost burden, we do have a program, our Business License Hearing Fund. If you know anyone opening a business in Denver who's, applying for a license that requires needs and desires, there is a fund available to help them offset those legal expenses. But we do acknowledge that that is not just a financial barrier, right? There are, that's a process that, access to legal assistance is, an equity issue. And so I think that's a really well taken point, and something to consider is the cost of participation. And we know that that is harder for certain communities to bear than other communities. If you want to add anything, but does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Tom, your hand is up. Do you have anything to add before we move on? So great discussion. We're going to jump into our next topic, data collection and tracking. Erica, are you taking us through this?
Yes, sorry.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So our next topic is data collection and tracking, right? So we often collect data and we analyze it on our programs to measure effectiveness and inform future improvements. I think also a newer trend in the city, in partnership with our Office of Social Equity and Innovation, is to track things that will, that are indicators of whether we're moving the needle on our equity work, whether it's performative or whether it's impactful. So here's some other examples, as we do with some other things, of types of data that we've collected in other areas. Starting with the cannabis industry, we collect and track data on all sorts of things, including number of licenses, social equity license ownership, sales and revenue, cannabis-related crime or offenses, including impaired driving, youth cannabis use, which I think Abby talked a little bit about earlier, and all sorts of other things, how the city spends the tax revenue collected. That's all on our website. It's in our annual report. That's linked there. And this is data we've been measuring for, I think, 11 years now plus. So it has helped us monitor impacts on public health, public safety. It's helped us identify possible policy or program improvements. Two examples of that are, like Abby mentioned, the Healthy Kids Colorado survey helps us advocate for funding for youth prevention programming to help, have kids, to help instill healthy perceptions about marijuana usage in youth that aren't kind of the scare tactics of the 80s, but still give them, the information they need to make good decisions. Another area where this data has been helpful is when we launched our delivery program, and we were, looking at who was adopting, who wasn't adopting, and it led us to creating a program that was exclusively delivery licenses for social equity applicants. So that's one kind of category of data that we've tracked. Another area is within demographic data. We ask license applicants to report demographic data for certain license types, including gender, ethnicity, and race. One thing about this is that that reporting is voluntary. It has no bearing on the outcome of the license application, and we definitely don't want folks to feel like it does, even if it doesn't, right? And so we do make that voluntary. That comes with its own challenges then, because while the reason we're collecting it is to help us identify where we should be doing additional outreach in pursuit of equity, we also know that there's the flip side of it too, right? And we don't want folks to feel like they have to answer or it's going to weigh negatively on their application. So that's always a challenging one. We've gotten feedback on this over the last couple of years that we should be doing it more, we should be doing it less, all for equity reasons. And so, that's one that we continue to refine. A new piece of information, and actually Councilman Hines was a big piece of this. We about a little over, or not quite a year ago, we started collecting data on accessibility features, short-term rental licenses. So Airbnb, Vrbo locations. One thing that we started getting asked about was, how accessible are these units? And we just didn't know because we weren't asking. So we started asking. We're about halfway through our first year of collecting that data. So we're starting to see what are the most popular accessibility features, what are the least popular accessibility features, where can we do education to increase accessibility within our short-term rentals, and then again, identifying any possible programs or solutions or education based on that. Another area is in environmental, and this is in our Office of Climate Action and Resiliency. I can never get that right. Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency that Val is with, and they do a lot of data collection around their disposable bag fee. So some of you might remember that there's a ban on plastic reusable or single-use bags in Denver. We collect a 10-cent fee for those bags. And then data about that revenue has informed the city about, is the ban working? Is there education needed? How do we measure the effectiveness of this particular policy? And how can we use that money to most impact future behavior changes? So here's just, these are hopefully a wide variety of examples, but certainly not all encompassing. And so to this group, we ask, what pieces of data are important for us as a city to collect and track as part of any natural medicine policies or programs to ensure that, we're measuring the things we need to measure to show that we're meeting success as it comes to be defined, and are able to make any adjustments that are data-based as we move forward. Tom, I see your hand up. I don't know if it was from before or if you have input here. Nope. Okay, that's all right.
Again, I have comments, but I would love to hear from someone who hasn't shared input yet. So I'll go ahead and take a back seat and allow that before I share.
Thanks, Carissa. Now is the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, Nico, go ahead.
Thanks. So DORA's draft rules for facilitators are requiring the collection of many data items, including some demographics about clients, medical screening information, administration details, adverse events, and outcomes data. The specific field level details are yet to be determined and will supposedly be taken up by the Natural Medicine Advisory Board in the coming weeks. While facilitators are collecting this information, it's like, that's great, but it's unclear if it will be aggregated and reported in a centralized way. I believe it's vitally important to measure program use and outcomes within this natural medicine program. There are still lots of unknowns about the efficacy and appropriate use and safety profiles of these medicines. So measuring these things in a real world setting will give us some insight into those questions. And that insight will additionally give us the evidence to create policy that will address the accessibility issues with the program, including potential insurance coverage and other aspects like that. And so I don't know how and if the state is centrally aggregating outcomes data. And that's something that Denver might want to ask our partners in the state. If they're not doing that, then I would recommend that Denver creates additional requirements for facilitators and healing centers to share that data with the city, so the city can do that analysis and answer those questions when we are looking for future policymaking, and when and if the public asks questions about the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Nico. Noah.
Like Nico said, there's already a lot of data that facilitators are going to be tracking. So I think some of the most important things to look for the effectiveness and inform future improvements would be verified complaints against any licensed facility, and really keeping track of the adverse reactions. I think we're already aware of the positive benefits that natural medicine can provide. So tracking the adverse reactions can help improvements in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. Krista?
Yeah, thanks, Nico, for those inputs there. I think that's really important, some of those data tracking. And like Gabby was saying, you know, data tells a story, and who the storyteller is really matters. The story they want to tell versus all of the stories that are, you know, captured within that data. So, you know, as Indigenous people, we have seen data be used against us in a way for generations and generations. So I completely understand the apprehension here in discussing this. I will offer that I would like to see data around waste and environmental impacts. Location is for accessibility reasons, financial accessibility data, revenue data around licensing for local people versus people from out of state or even out of country, and how that is impacting communities as far as costs of living here. Medical data for, like Noah and Nico were saying, for adverse reactions, not necessarily, you know, very personalized data, but general and aggregated. One thing when I was looking at this question that came to mind is that I recently read an article about how Oregon has seen far less activity and revenue with natural medicine healing centers, far less than expected. And if anybody else here read that, and if I'm, you know, giving out misinformation, or if you have anything to add, please do. But this lack or underestimation of activity and revenue coming into these facilities, this has forced many of those facilities to close down. And the ones that have stayed alive are, you know, many of them are backed by extremely wealthy funders. The glaring issue that they identified was that healing sessions and retreats are often inaccessible and very expensive. And I think there was, to put it in perspective, I think there was one number thrown out there that these sessions at healing centers costed something like $1,500. And for perspective here, $1,500 is about half of my rent. It would take me years to save up $1,500. We need medicine to be more accessible than being able to do this every couple years. There are people that need this on a more regular basis. And many, as I mentioned before, many of the impacted people who are seeking natural medicine tend to be disproportionately impacted and have lower socioeconomic status in this country, and in Denver and in Colorado. So I would like to see data collected around how we are continuously championing the accessibility to medicine for disproportionately impacted communities and people. And that's in addition to, I think what Erica shared, I think those were all helpful. And again, a good baseline. And Nico, thank you for that input too. So I agree with those as well.
Thanks, Carissa. Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, great. So next we're going to talk about business licensing and the need for a local license. So I'm going to hand it over to Molly to take us through these slides.
All right. Hi, everybody. I apologize. I had a conflict at the first half of the meeting, so I hopped on about a half an hour ago and have been able to hear that discussion, but I apologize for missing the first little bit. But I will make sure to go back and check out the recording. So I think for here, the next couple slides, we just kind of want to wrap up the discussion and kind of come back to some of the beginning questions that we asked now that we've had a lot of discussion since then. And so first, we're just going to want to revisit and kind of come back to the question around just whether we should or shouldn't license. So as just a summary, the city only requires a business license for certain types of businesses that may have impacts on public health, public safety, or community welfare. So we listed some examples here. Liquor businesses, marijuana, tobacco, massage, childcare establishment, private security employers, as well as the security guards themselves, body art businesses, short-term rentals, residential rentals. And then there are, several types of businesses, many types of businesses in Denver that we don't license. A lot of those just don't have the public health and safety concerns that would rise to the level that we would need to regulate through a license. And then just to give a little bit of background and context for the process, when a business is going through the process to get a license, and this is very, very high level, just to get an understanding. But the applicant first submits the application to Excise and Licenses. And then we review the application to make sure that the business has all the required documentation, is meeting the requirements. And then if necessary, a public hearing is scheduled, and then we assign inspections after that if they successfully make it through the public hearing process. If one is needed, many businesses don't actually need a public hearing. But then if they move on to the inspection process, then the relevant departments perform inspections to determine whether that actual building and location is in compliance with local codes and laws. And so the types of departments or which departments perform those inspections can vary based on license type, based on what it is that we're looking for and what we're trying to make sure they're in compliance with, and what our safety or health risks are. And so, but they would go through those inspections depending on which license type they have. And then once all inspections or hearings are passed and fully in compliance, then we would issue the license. So obviously there's lots of other details in that, but at a high level, that is the process. And then we do perform regular inspections. A lot of them are complaint-based, but we will, check in on businesses to make sure they are remaining in compliance. And if necessary, we can take disciplinary action against a license. So with all the discussions we've had and with that context of what it looks like for a business to go through our department to get a license, I guess we just wanted to come back to some of the earlier questions we had and get some closing feedback from all of you of whether you feel that Denver should require a local license for natural medicine facilities, in addition to the license required by the state of Colorado. And the sub question is, if so, should a license be required for all types of natural medicine facilities or just certain types, knowing those kind of 4 types that the state is licensing? So we'll open that up for discussion now.
Noah, go ahead.
So I do think that there should be additional licenses required to ensure the safety of employees the community and the environment. It shouldn't be for every type of license. This should only be required for licenses that are going to extract natural medicine with ethanol or methanol. Thank you.
Thanks, Noah. Carissa?
Yeah, I think licenses should be required for all types of natural medicine facilities. But I have a couple of questions for clarity because the licensing is not something that I think I have the least amount of information about that process. So the previous slide was really helpful. And one of my questions was in regard to cultivators with the inspections. So the process that you laid out, Molly, does that mean that, for example, if I applied for a cultivator license, that inspection doesn't mean that they would, in order to get the license, my facility would have to be inspected. But what doesn't make sense to me is obtaining the facilities, the equipment, the labor could be hundreds of thousands of dollars sometimes just to get started. So as a business person and a cultivator, I'm not really excited about putting forth all of that money, getting loans or whatever that means before even knowing if I'm going to receive that license. So I was wondering if you can clear up that part of the process for me, please.
Yeah, and Abby and Erica, feel free to jump in if I miss anything, but, so I think that, first of all, as a part of the preliminary review of the application, one of the first things we would look at is if the location complies, right? And so if, this is, you know, we don't know what some of these requirements would be, but if there was any type of requirement, and we do have some of the stuff, you know, from the state, but if there was some type of requirement of that the business had to be a certain distance from another type of activity, then that would be determined in the pre-review before it even moved on to hearing and or inspections. So that would be one thing where the business applicant would know that before they moved on too far in the process. And then as far as the inspection goes, it's most of the things that are identified through an inspection are things that the business can go and remedy. It is not things that are going to disqualify that location or that facility from being licensed. It is things saying like, and again, these are requirements that we don't even know what we'd be looking for in an inspection for this type of business yet. So we're presupposing some stuff here, but it would just be looking for things that could likely be remedied by the business applicant, whether that's like signage for certain areas or something like that. Those are the types of things that would be looking for an inspection.
Okay, so just to be clear, an applicant wouldn't have to already have deeply invested into a business that they may or may not be licensed for.
Yeah, sorry. You would likely be required to have a lease or something of the property. And you would also then, the timing of the inspection usually happens right before the business is about to open. And so it really is after maybe construction has happened, if there needs to be any, and it's really set up to start operating. And so that's how the inspectors are able to identify what things are not in compliance with the requirements. But I think anything that would prohibit a business from moving forward with that particular location would be identified earlier in the process. Things that can be remedied and addressed and fixed would be identified later on in the process. Does that seem like a fair explanation to Abby and Erica, and maybe other city agencies that are on here that would do the inspections?
Yeah, and I had two additional just kind of points to consider, right? As we're kind of thinking of creativity and different models. We have a couple other features, right? So for complex applications with our department, either like a common consumption area or even a marijuana application, we offer pre-application meetings. And those are also, I think, available in other departments, but kind of before you get started, before you submit an application, things to know, stuff that Molly was talking about, right, about the location or things that would kind of be from the beginning qualifiers. So those are things we can consider adding as part of the process. And for most of our business licenses, it does follow the process Molly mentioned, right, where the inspection is done right before the business opens. We also have one license, our residential rental license, where they do a private inspection just with the home inspection company, and they include that as part of their application. So they're already pre-inspected before they apply with us. So we have a couple of different tools and models. So if there's something that feels better or not good for this type of model, that's good to know too.
Okay, yeah, I would think that, I wonder if there could be some sort of accessibility path so that people aren't having to lay down leases, very expensive leases. For example, I had somebody that the smallest facility they could find was $6,000 a month. So, you know, to put a lease down, that's you know, over $70,000 for a year. And you know, that really presents an accessibility barrier. So I'm wondering if there could be certain kinds of adjustments to be made. For example, of like, you can apply for licenses with like your plan, your business plan, or your strategic plan. And then like, there's a time period to execute that. Yeah, I'd be open to discussing further some more creative problem solving in that area. For another question I had was between the state and the local licenses. I'm interested to know what the difference would be in accessibility as far as financially, but also what other barriers are present a difference in those two types of licenses, and particularly I'm unaware about the offices, excise offices rules on licensing formerly incarcerated people and undocumented people.
Yeah, those are great questions. So in terms of fees for license fees, the state has not started their rulemaking for setting fees because they're finalizing their rules before they can really dive into what the cost would be to the department. But I, you know, obviously we'll be keeping an eye on that process, and then our fees would be commensurate with the cost of what it would cost the department to administer the license. So what it costs us to process applications and conduct those inspections, and you know, build out our Acela portal, our licensing portal to process those applications. All of that obviously costs the city money, and so that's what our fees would be based on. But I can't give really specific information about like dollar amounts at this point. I think our priority would be to make it as financially accessible as possible. I'm blanking on your second question. Erica, do you have any insight on that?
I asked about licensing formerly incarcerated people
right.
and undocumented folks.
Thank you. So again, that would depend on state rules and their eligibility criteria. I think those are still undergoing the rulemaking process, but they do have some disqualifying criteria related to criminal background. And then at the local level, we could also institute additional requirements as well. But I'm not sure what that would look like. So appreciate any feedback that you want to submit related to those topics for sure.
Thank you.
All right, we'll go next to Gabriella.
Yeah, once again, just kind of finding all of this being such a major catch-22. You know, the whole licensing, that whole process is definitely not the way that Indigenous communities pass on this tradition. So I would just want to acknowledge that, you know, this is not really in general a consented form, a consented way to practice this medicine through regulatory and through this whole process as the state of Colorado is now soon to enact. So my concerns there are, do you know how much the licensing costs and fees would be? Because there's also the licensing fee for the facilitator, the practitioner, and then we've talked here about the different licenses and the licenses that you can hold together. as a manufacturer and then as a cultivator. Do you have the breakdown of what those approximate licensing fees would be? And then in addition to the leasing fees and all of the attorney fees, the community hearing fees, and the discrimination that can happen in all of these processes is also really concerning to me, which goes and ties into, you know, who can receive a license if the state of Colorado is determining that, if industry is determining that, if the pharmaceutical industry, who have been leading these conversations on the erasure of the people of these traditions. And on the one hand, it feels like an additional licensing, like I would potentially, that might be supportive if it is something that brings more protections to Indigenous communities. So something that, you know, if there's more requirements or more formal steps to take, that industry, who are likely going to be the only companies to afford these operations. I think I lost my train of thought there, but oh yeah, this little fever is a little strong. Sorry, can somebody remind me what I was saying? I was saying that only major corporations can afford to do this. And yeah, please remind me, sorry.
That's okay. I don't know where you're going, but you did mention kind of the taking into account all the different costs, right? Not just the license fees, which we wouldn't know yet, but the costs associated with, you know, securing a lease or securing the professionals to help. And I think you were encouraging us to consider not just the cost of a license, but all of those additional costs that are associated. Is that accurate?
Yes, most likely only going to be afforded to big industry and big pharmaceutical and lawyers and the tech industry, you know, all these different so-called stakeholders who really most don't come from Indigenous communities or have the best interests of Indigenous communities in mind. So that would be the kind of the catch-22 about the licensing, because then it would make an additional licensing might also make it harder for a person of color or a person with less access to have to get a license and to open such businesses. And even just talking about this cultural richness and wealth of Indigenous communities as a business is really troublesome. So I just want to name that piece, and thanks so much for your patience with me and reminding me where I was going. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, even though you're not feeling well. Hope you're feeling better soon.
All right, Nico?
Yeah, so as Carissa, I think, mentioned earlier, what we've learned from Oregon's program is that these businesses will be challenging for them to make ends meet. Demand in Oregon was actually lower than expected, and costs, including the already significant state licensing fees and meeting state requirements, caused prices to be extremely high. Healing Advocacy Fund estimates that the prices in Oregon for a one-on-one session is around $2,500. So if we're concerned about reducing costs and increasing accessibility to these services, then we should strive for reducing direct licensing costs and the regulatory burden that's associated with them. So a reduction in these costs will reduce, at the end of the day, will reduce consumer price and increase accessibility to potential license holders who may not be able to afford a higher price. Additionally, I haven't heard reasons as to why Denver would have significantly different needs than the wider state in regards to these types of businesses, or that the state rules as they are drafted are significantly insufficient, except for what I mentioned around the uncertainty in regarding capturing outcomes in a centralized place for program analysis. So therefore, and in conclusion, I do not think that we should require additional local licensing requirements. Thank you.
Thanks, Nico. Dale, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I would take the opinion, I think, yes, we should have a Denver specific license. Denver is a unique jurisdiction in terms of population and impact, presence of the airport, presence of Denver Health, safety net institution, and some considerations related to Denver Sheriff's Office, public health, all sorts of perhaps a city-specific activism going on as well. So I think that makes us unique enough that there should be a license specific to Denver. What I anticipate is it would kind of set up some infrastructure in place already if down the line the city does figure out we do have a priority on something like public health or a priority on cultural education behind this, which has been mentioned so many times during these sessions. And this could be an avenue both of compliance and encouraging further education and perhaps restricting advertising more or something like that. But also monetarily, the nominal fee, hopefully it is affordable and doesn't have major impacts on the end product price, so to speak. But the nominal fee could be aggregated and used, specifically to fund cultural education efforts and public health efforts. And being the city that we are, I suspect we'd be a model for many other jurisdictions who go through this process too.
Thank you, Dale. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Hope, go ahead.
Sure, I wrote in the comments, but I really don't think that there's a necessity for local licensing. Everything that Nico stated, I agree 100% with. Whenever I think about additional licensing, I think about barriers to entry. So one of those things is like the additional paperwork, which is already going to be extensive with the state, and the cost to add additional licenses. Even though it may be nominal, I still think, there is a significant cost to that. On top of everything else, as we specifically talk about, I'm specifically speaking about healing centers. There's been a lot of conversation, and I know this isn't the indigenous way, the indigenous practice, but as it relates to the program in Colorado, there's been lots of talk about it being modeled, after the therapeutic model. In that case, the therapeutic model is actually governed by the state, not local municipalities. And as Dale stated earlier, if other municipalities start to follow the model of Denver, that's going to create more barriers to entry for people who might want to locate in, 2 or 3 different municipalities. So that's all.
Thank you, Hope. Else?
All right.
Okay. So we'll move on to, I think we'll skip our next question, just as we're running out of time and want to make sure we have plenty of time to talk about next steps and give folks attending a chance to make public comments. But we'll talk more about how to submit that feedback as well. So Molly, do you want to take us through next steps?
Yep, absolutely. So we will be sending out some additional information and following this meeting today. So there'll be a member feedback survey that we will ask if you would like to please complete for us, talking about the process and your participation in it and how it went. This is really helpful feedback for us as we engage in these types of processes and take public feedback and stakeholder feedback. It's really helpful for us to know your feedback on that. And then we'll also be sharing with you a written comment form, and we encourage you, it'll encompass a lot of the discussions and questions that we've talked about throughout the process, and give you an opportunity to kind of summarize your feedback for us, as we finalize and make these decisions. This will also be available to the members of the public to complete their comment form. And that will be, so we'll be sharing that out for everybody to provide back some more written comments to us for what you weren't able to share here, or if you have some follow-up comments that you think of later. And so in order to receive all of that, not the members of the work group, but members of the public, if you're not signed up for the Natural Medicine Bulletin, please go ahead and sign up for that if you'd like to receive the written comment form. And then we'll be sharing that with the members of the work group as well.
And we'll also have that form on our website, which is denvergov.org/natural medicine.
And then what happens after that is we will take some time with city staff to review all of the discussions, the recordings, our notes from them, and then the written comments that are submitted. We'll continue to monitor the state rulemaking process, which is wrapping up in the next little bit here. And then we may reach out to additional work group members individually if we're working through and more questions come up and we're just looking for more information. Then we'll reach out to work group members individually to kind of clarify thoughts or follow up with questions. And then we'll use all of this information and input that we've gathered through this process to formulate a recommendation for the mayor's office and city council. And then any city council action that if a recommendation is made that requires city council action, then there is a full public process that will go on with that process as well. There would be committee meetings and then city council meetings where there would be opportunity for public input on that as well. And so just to close that out, the Natural Medicine Division for the state will hold its final hearing on permanent rules on next Thursday, July 25th, beginning at 9 a.m. And the website is there if you want to take a look at the draft rules and information about attending the hearing. And all the information and how the rules are adopted and what that looks like is definitely a huge consideration point for us as we make this final recommendation. So we'll be following and tracking along with that and encourage you all to do the same. And I think that's it before we jump into public comment. Anything I missed mentioning, Abby and Erica? And yes, to answer the question, I think that just popped up, will we be sharing the recommendation? Yes, absolutely. There will be some communication back to this work group in that Natural Medicine Bulletin on our website. What the recommendation is will definitely be, we will close that loop with you all for sure.
Okay. So now we will open the floor. Well, first I want to see if anybody else has questions about next steps before we move to public comment. Any other questions? Gabrielle asked, can we attend city council meetings? Yes, all city council meetings are open to the public and there's an opportunity for public comment at certain meetings of city council. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out to your city council member that represents the district in which you live, or either of the at-large council members, and all of that information is available on the city's website.
And as the bulletins and the website will be a great way to stay up to date on anything that is happening. Like I said, we will, once we make a recommendation, and if we decide to bring something forward to city council, we would be definitely sharing that information. And then as we'd be going through the city council process, we would be sharing that through the bulletin. Any upcoming dates or opportunities for public input would be shared through the bulletin and on our website, and probably directly with the work group as well.
I have a quick question about city council public comment. I understand there's a rule if like a buffer time of like 3 months or something if you've given public comment before. Is that in relation to like the same topic? So if you've given public comment within the last 3 months before this is presented on a different topic, can you still provide public comment on this when it is presented to city council?
Do either of our council members have an answer to that question? I would defer to them.
Yeah, so that actually pertains to prioritizing folks being able to participate in public comment. So we only can take a certain amount of folks who can participate in public comment because we have a short amount of time allotted for public comment. But we also always have the opportunity to add additional time. So if this was something that was on an agenda where we wanted to have specific public comment that was germane to this, that we could absolutely do that as council. But that rule usually comes in place when we have a list that's longer than the actual time that we have allotted for council, that we would prioritize folks that we hadn't heard from in the past month over folks who we maybe hear from more regularly to get more folks voices in the conversation.
Okay. Thank you, Councilwoman.
Sure.
Okay, and I'll just add that you'll all receive an email right after this meeting with a link to the a link to the member feedback survey and a link to that written comment worksheet. Okay, let's go ahead and open the floor for public comments. If you are in the audience and you'd like to make a public comment, please click the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen and I will allow you to unmute yourself. My timer is not active because, and I think it's because I copied and pasted this slide, and so there's not an actual YouTube video here, it's just a photo. So I apologize for that. We won't have a live timer today, but I'll try and keep an eye on the time and just please try to limit yourself to 2 minutes so that we can get to as many folks as would like to make a comment. So first we have Carly Bader. Carly, you should be able to unmute.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So while we have been in this room, 45 minutes ago, we did in fact receive from Colorado Department of Revenue, the Division of Natural Medicine, the newest rules. I do want to communicate to this team at large for all the amazing work that they have been doing, that this first draft was 25 pages and this next draft is at 120 pages. So really taking the next week to dive into the nitty-gritty of what has been written from what started as 20 pages, and really to get a good understanding of what is in black and white, today and by next week, and really diving into these specific details, because this is quickly going to turn into the law, and we need to delve into these rules specifically in the ways that they are written here. So I'm Carly Bader from Willow Scientific. I'm a molecular microbiologist in the space, come from cannabis. I know we're supposed to announce our name and affiliation, but again, I have over 8 years in the cannabis industry and I really understand this process and want to implore the people to read these documents very carefully and understand without proper public engagement and public comment on these specific black and white regulations, we won't have any action. So we really need to get into this as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly, and that's a great call to action. Just want to emphasize that the state rules are totally separate from Denver's local rules, but definitely very important for everyone to take a look at those, and we'll be monitoring those as well and reading them from cover to cover to really inform our process here locally. All right, next we have Christopher Maestas. You should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, my name is Christopher Maestas. I work in post-acute healthcare and behavioral health. Generally, I would weigh in with the folks and agree that I think additional licensing by the city of Denver is probably unnecessary. Although a case could be made that for extraction facilities, there might be a safety oversight that I could understand. But considering the quick implementation, it's been brought up about maybe not everybody who should be in these meetings is here, people who are going to come late to the process, as well as concerns about being able to do outreach and education and possibly even for future changes, depending on what might happen. Maybe the city doesn't need to consider a license, but maybe in order to help protect the community and give us resources and data, which is what we really need, some sort of registry so that we can know who is doing this work in Denver, where they are, and just what kind of the parameters or the services they offer, what kind of populations they're serving. And we can promote access then to those underserved groups. There can be a centralized place where you could go look to find somebody as opposed to just trying to Google and see what you can come up with. That would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we'll go next to Kendra. Kendra, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just want to make a public comment here. I've been hearing a lot about barriers to entry and whatnot. I'm actually not for this style of healing anyway. I don't think the government or anybody's really qualified to be involved with specifically native medicines. I believe there's an authorization process to that, and that's why we're kind of meeting in these spaces to formalize our opinions here. But as we talk about barriers to entry, I got a lot of feelings that come up because people say, oh, well, you can't have a felony if you're going to enter this arena, and feelings of privilege come up here. Many people have been, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous, have been held down for so long. And so when we embark on this mission of capitalistic extractive behaviors, we need to think about these things. And that's the only really comment I want to make. I'm not really interested in joining this space or, unless there's like some kind of massive understanding on how we got here between groups of people. But I don't really think the current public system is going to be able to even help our people. And so I want to make that comment just to raise that awareness that, the gap is getting gone, and it's only going to be when people decide to not go along with the status quo that real change will be made and actual healing will be made. And I'm just one voice of many. So thank you for letting me comment.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Please feel free to raise your hand. I see Lizette. Lizette, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for all the work that you're doing. I want to make a couple of comments about different things. I'm going to start with marketing piece. I know I've been part of hearing this advisory board and also the Indigenous State Advisory Board, and I couldn't hear exactly what the marketing pieces were, but I remember Commissioner Thomas, Tom Allen, mentioned that the marketing should be as plain as possible, and I do agree with him because I'm seeing a lot of candy-like stuff for this medicine in particular, and we're talking about psilocybin. The part with the licenses, I agree with the lady that spoke about lack of access. I think that, liquor licenses, mental health licenses, medical licenses are all held through the State Department. So to have more cost on top of everything just seems it seems to me like the city is trying to create more revenue streams. And, as an Indigenous people, I do not agree with the extractivism and the exploitation of these natural medicines. So the licensure piece doesn't seem in alignment with trying to give access to people to mental health when the costs are already incredibly high. And also, I wanted to just bring up what is happening in Oregon and how the state of Oregon grossly overestimated the amount of revenue that was going to come into the state because of this new industry complex that the government is creating. So I would really like for you to look at those numbers and see what the reality is in Oregon versus what they estimated and overestimated in order to make decisions. And I also would like to learn more about how you guys are going to regulate the data collection, because time and time again, we just continue to see breaches of data collections and just making people even more vulnerable to just whoever gets this information. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next we'll go to One Chance to Grow Up. You should have the ability to unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Julie with One Chance to Grow Up. And I would just like to mimic and agree with Lizette's comments on we do not believe that there should be any candy or soft confections that are in the psilocybin market, as they would be kid friendly and child appealing. And we also, I know the state has made comments about possibly having it outside of healing centers, as the healers can go to people's homes possibly, or in yoga studios, and we disagree with that. It should stay in the healing center model as it was approved by the voters. And we also agree with a strong education campaign by the city. Thank you for your time and thanks for all you're doing.
Thank you. All right. Not seeing any new hands raised. So I will turn it back over to Molly just for a few closing remarks, and we can end the meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Abby. And so first I want to thank Abby. She has put a lot of work into all of these presentations and gathering information and staying up to date on all of the rulemaking at the state. So a huge kudos to her for keeping us all organized and keeping our discussions on track, and keeping us informed and aware of all the information that we need in order to make this decision and have these discussions. So thank you very much, Abby. And thank you so much to the work group. You guys, your thoughts and your opinions and your input and your perspectives all have been very, very important and critical. You have given us really deep insights and a lot to think about. And I really appreciate the time and the effort and the thoughtfulness that you all have dedicated to this. And just really want to express our gratitude and our commitment to staying in touch with you and in communication and following back up. This has been very helpful and informative, and we just really appreciate you all taking the time to do this with us. And feel free to reach out anytime directly. Please, please, please fill out the comment form and be as thorough and detailed as you can. We will read through every single one of them. We want to take this process, very seriously and take our time to deliberate on these questions as much as possible, and your input is very critical. So I think that's it, other than just another expression of gratitude and thank you. We will be in touch. You'll be continuing to hear from us.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks. Yeah.